Hey guys. All right, there it is. Okay. So happy Monday. If you can believe it, there's only 2 Mondays today and next Monday, and we are done with this school year. It just seems kind of crazy. I feel like this has been like the hardest school year I've ever had. And at times I felt like it's just been creeping along, but yet at the same time, it feels like I can't believe it's the end of the year already. Um, all right. With that being said, we've got three more lessons: lesson 6, which is what we're covering today, and lesson 7, which is the Holocaust, and then 8, which is the end of the war. And if those of you at home, on Friday of this week, in person learners are going to have kind of an off day because you have the academic awards ceremonies and then the senior signing and commitment ceremonies taking place. And so I will actually not see any of my like regular students that day. I got started a little early. So, anyways, those of you at home, don't expect really anything from me on Friday because it's again, it's going to be like it's not a traditional day. But where was I going with this? Oh, okay. So I'm going to post what the schedule is going to look like for the next couple of weeks, here in the home stretch, so that when your unit 13 test is, and things like that. So just kind of be on the lookout for that in Google Classroom as an announcement, because of course I don't want any of you feeling like you're going into the last 2 weeks of school not really understanding my expectations and what's coming. So okay. If you have any questions, as always, guys, feel free to email me and let me know. Hopefully, those of you at home can attest to the fact that if you shoot me an email and ask me a question, I'm going to respond to you, hopefully that day. If not that day, then definitely by the next day. So, okay, here we go. Home front and civilians. This is actually going to go pretty quick. Oh, I hate my head is messing that up. Dang it. All right. Oh, well. Okay, here we go. World War II, just like World War I, is a total war. We talked about that pretty extensively during our World War I unit. Okay, so if you remember, that means that everybody is involved, right? I mean, this is not just the military. This is a political and economic effort. You have women, of course, going into the factories, taking up the labor vacuum created with all of the men going to war. But there is a huge difference in terms of the impact of total war between 1 and 2. And unfortunately, that is the civilian casualty rate. This is why I was saying, like, I hate that my head blocks that chart. But I want you to take the time, however, and go back and look at this, because it will show you that in World War I, 86% of the casualties was military, 14% are civilians. And I can't remember the exact percentages, but you will see in the World War II pie chart that civilians are at like 50 some odd percent, whereas the military is at 40 something percent. So there was actually more civilians killed than military deaths. And again, this is women, children, elderly, and it's unfortunately because civilian bombing raids became kind of standard practice during World War II, and we're going to be talking about that here a little later in more detail. But the Soviet Union, just like in World War I, is going to see the highest rate of casualties, and it's because, again, like Lenin could care less. The man has no heart or soul and doesn't care how many people he kills that are his own. I mean, he's very willing to just like throw people at his problems. If you'll remember from the last unit, the man kills over 20 million Russians before World War II even begins. So, but also in addition to that, if you remember from lesson 5, Operation Barbarossa, which was Hitler's big push east, and the big betrayal, of course, of Hitler towards Stalin. Their sieges on some of these Soviet cities is just going to be catastrophic for the people there. You know, you're going to have supplies that are not going to get into these cities because they're under siege. And so, in addition to women, children, elderly, and soldiers dying from battle and bombing within the city, you also have people just starving to death. If you watch some of the videos, Tom Brokaw is even going to talk about, during the siege of Stalingrad, that the Germans are going to ask the little, like little children to go fill up their water canteens from the river for like a piece of bread. And Stalin would have those children shot by snipers. I mean, again, like, because he looked at the kids that were doing that as traitors. I mean, they're starving to death. They just want the piece of bread. But, when you're dealing with Stalin. So, one of the things that Stalin does that no other leader does is he allows women into the military. You had actual entire sniper divisions within the Soviet military that were women. You also had entire bombing pilots, like that were women within the Soviet Air Force. So I mean, and it's not because Stalin believed in women's rights and was some like great feminist. It's because he just didn't really care, like that there wasn't this whole like, oh, we can't have women in combat because they're delicate and should be protected. Like that's he didn't, no, like anybody and everybody can die and should die in order to win and keep the Soviet Union going so that I can maintain my power. But that was a big difference, however, within the Soviet Union. The United States, obviously we were bombed at Pearl Harbor, but beyond that, of course, we didn't see any, major bombings. That's one of the things that's very different in terms of the American history viewpoint on both world wars. We don't have our major cities bombed into oblivion, and we don't experience that. Gratefully so, but it definitely changes the overall, viewpoint of these conflicts. However, women, of course, go back into the workplace. The very famous Rosie the Riveter comes to mind. And yeah, like we have victory gardens that get planted. There's actually entire, because if you've ever been to a big city and like walked around, you will stumble across like a city park, when you're walking around from block to block. A lot of those city parks turned into huge gardens during the war that they nicknamed, of course, victory gardens. And so there was lots of course, total war home effort to keep supplies up. This is just a video about the home front in the United States. That video will end talking about kind of one of the darker moments in American history during World War II, and that was the Japanese internment. So over 100,000 Japanese Americans are going to be placed in internment camps during World War II. And there were also German Americans and Italian Americans that were also basically imprisoned in these internment camps / like prisoner of war camps during World War II, but not nearly as many as the Japanese. The Japanese made up the dominant group that were imprisoned. And it's really quite sad. What ends up happening is that, that it's viewed as they might be spies, and unfortunately there, some of them sure were. It was but as a teeny tiny group of people that were actually spies for the Japanese versus the majority, if not close to all of them, were unfortunately just kind of like collateral damage in the bigger political game that is war. And I mean, their businesses were seized, their homes were seized, tons of discrimination and racism, as you can see there in that picture. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. And there was a lot of overall, of course, resentment and hatred towards the Japanese due to Pearl Harbor. Even though, again, many of these people, not the adults, but their kids, of course, were born in the United States and were just as American as you and I. And, they didn't, they were just kids. But, um, you know, some of them were worse off than others in terms of kind of what their internment camps looked like. This is a great video to watch of a man that lived in these internment camps because his dad and his uncle actually both were imprisoned. These families, of course, were split apart for years at a time. Um, because the dad may be over here in like an internment prisoner of war camp, whereas, his wife and kids are at like a family internment camp. So anyways, it's like I said, it's a darker portion of our history for sure. So I challenge you to watch that video or any other video you might find. There's some interesting ones out there for sure. Okay, so Germany at home during World War II, if it were up to Hitler, remained this like bubble of, almost like utopia. Like, war is raging all around us, but it's like peace and perfectness here at home. And for the first couple of years of war, he managed to achieve that. And remember, if you're a woman, in Hitler's eyes, all you need to be doing is being at home and being a wife and being a mother and like raising as many babies as you can possibly produce. And so because of that very traditional viewpoint that he had, he did not want women, or German women, in the factory or in the workforce. And so, their factories a lot of times were ran by, slave labor, Slavic people, Jewish people. A lot of their factories were also like would coincide and be next to concentration camps. But the problem is when you're killing off your workforce in a genocide, you're going to have to fill that labor shortage some kind of way. And by late 1942, early 1943, Hitler begins to realize, like, I've got to put women into the factories because this is no longer a sustainable model. The people are going to have to start to feel the effects of war because, Operation Barbarossa again marks pretty much the beginning of the end. I mean, it's his huge mistake. Had he never invaded the Soviet Union and betrayed Stalin, I mean, who knows? He may have been unstoppable, which is scary to think about. So, like, thank God for Operation Barbarossa. But, again, by late 42, early 43, even Hitler starts to realize, okay, we need to up production. And again, that arrogance of like, I'm not going to have my people be affected by this at all. Women are not going to go into the factories and stuff like that. That kind of arrogance of my people will remain untouched through this actually, again, helps the Allies out because their production is going to be hurt in the process. Okay, so Japan kind of views the workforce much like Germany. Like, women in Japan never work in the factories. They have slave labor out of Korea and China for that. And if you listened to the previous lessons, of course, you remember me talking about how the Japanese really, in all reality, treat the Chinese just as badly as the Germans treat the Jews. I mean, they're going to kill millions of Chinese during World War II and Koreans. And if they don't kill them, they use them as slave labor. So, that's how Japan basically keeps up the war effort in terms of factories and production back home. And then, if you ever extensively listen to war veterans from World War II, there's a very big difference in how the war was fought in the European arena and the Pacific arena. In the European arena, you have to think this is Western Judeo-Christian, overall, like white men fighting each other. So they have this kind of similar viewpoint of war and how it should be fought, and kind of like they have the same kind of like unspoken rules about what you do and don't do, even to an enemy soldier. Japan has a completely different culture and a completely different set of overall views and beliefs about warfare. And of course, they are honestly a much more brutal enemy to fight. The Pacific arena, in my personal opinion, after pretty extensive research into World War II, was a way more horrific arena and place to fight than in the European arena. And so the Japanese, the point I'm trying to make is they, as a culture, they viewed the Japanese soldier as like, if you do come home from war, it's almost like dishonorable. Like, well, why are you home? Like, you're supposed to go and die for your country. And that brings massive honor, not only to you, but to your family and to your country. So like, even if, I mean, that's the reason why, if you ever watch movies, prime examples like Hacksaw Ridge, you see the Japanese literally fighting to the absolute death and taking out as many as there is absolutely no self-preservation. And it's because it was viewed as, again, like dishonorable pretty much to even think about self-preservation. It was like, I'm in the Japanese military and I will die for Japan. I mean, guys, they're going to find Japanese soldiers like decades after the war is over, still like holed up in these mountains, in these remote islands in the Pacific, living off of like a bag of rice. I mean, because whenever they're found, they are like still in that, like, I'm going to fight to the death mentality. So one of the things about the Pacific arena that becomes incredibly difficult, of course, for the Allies at the end of specifically like 44, is the kamikaze pilots. So these are pilots who are placed on basically like suicide missions. I mean, they purposely fly their airplanes into Allied ships to sink them or massively just, damage them. And of course, like kill as many Allied soldiers that were on that ship as possible. And this is an incredible video from Smithsonian that has like archived footage, and they've turned it into color of kamikaze attacks on our ships. And it's pretty crazy, like some of them that are on this little just 3 or 4 minute clip. But it'll tell you there at the end, there's going to be like 1,900 planes that the Japanese are going to purposely fly as kamikazes into our ships. It's going to sink like 26 of our ships. But I mean, you got to think that's almost 2,000 Japanese pilots that are going to, of course, die in these suicide missions. And, again, in the Western Judeo-Christian culture, that's, suicide, of course, is viewed as like, oh my gosh, you don't do that, you're going to end up in hell. It's a cowardly act. It's very, very like frowned upon. Again, like in the Japanese culture, it was considered this huge honor, like you died for your country, and your family is given honors, and, it's just considered this really honorable death. But in our eyes, it was like inhumane warfare. So again, just culturally, we were at odds in the Pacific arena of World War II. Okay, so like I said, we were going to talk about the bombing of cities more later. Well, here's the later. If you look at some of these images that I have posted, I mean, it almost, it looks like dystopic. What's so crazy is though, like if you look at this picture right here to the like left of my face, you can see that's actually in Cologne, I believe, Germany. It's either Cologne or Dresden. I can't really, I think it's Cologne. Um, and you can see the cathedral of Cologne there, and all around it is just like bombed into oblivion. But they didn't bomb the church, and that's one of those like it's a war. Studying war can be really weird because again, you're kind of like they have these unspoken rules of well, you know, we're going to bomb the crap out of civilians and kill hundreds of thousands of women and children and elderly, but like don't mess with the old like historic churches. Okay. I mean, which I mean, thank God as a historian, like those are some of the main things that you want to go visit when you go to Europe. I mean, I literally cried the day Notre Dame was on fire. You can ask students that were in my class that day. I was like literally just like bawling, like watching the news going, oh my God, please tell me that they saved Notre Dame, which they did, thank goodness. But I'm just saying, I mean, yes, that's some of the main things that you go and you look at when you travel abroad. But again, like it's just interesting. So the initial justification, you could say, behind city bombings during World War II was okay, it's going to lower morale, and the civilian population will hate this and obviously be really upset by it and put a whole lot of pressure on their governments to make peace with Hitler, and try to make sure that this doesn't keep up, that this stops. Well, it does the exact opposite. Like, if anything, it just really, really hacks the civilian population off even more and is like, go kill them. I mean, like go give the enemy hell instead of like, oh, let's make peace talks. So the whole psychological prediction did not pan out for the initial reasons behind the bombings. And then it almost turned into, unfortunately, like a competition of, especially towards the end of the war, like, okay, because the Germans are just going to give Britain, HELL between the end of 1939 and, 1941. They're going to bomb the ever-loving tar out of British cities, but specifically London, and very famously what's known as the Blitz. But at the end of 44, like towards the end of the war, the Royal Air Force is going to like bomb really, really horribly the city of Dresden and Cologne in Germany, and actually end up doing way more damage and killing more people in Germany than they ever did in Britain and London during the Blitz. But the Blitz is very famous. London is going to sustain pretty massive damage. That picture right there is St. Paul's Cathedral, the dome. I actually saw shrapnel damage actually on the wall at St. Paul's in London when I was there studying World War II. And they left it on this one particular section of the wall at St. Paul's, so just basically kind of like as a remembrance of the Blitz. It would also be strange to be like walking around London and you could tell there were these like, areas of buildings that had been there for a really long time. And then all of a sudden the buildings kind of looked newer. And, our professor would basically be like, well, that entire block got taken out during the Blitz. And so that's why those apartments and those buildings look newer. It's because they were built in like the 1950s, whereas across the street was built in like, like the 1750s. So, sometimes it was crazy to see the contrast due to the damage. But during the Blitz, of course, millions of children are going to be evacuated along with their mothers out into the countryside, hoping to spare them from, death and the bombings. This is very famously showcased in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Narnia books, when the kids, of course, at the very beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe are being carted off to their uncle's house in the countryside because of the Blitz. So this is just another good video, real quick about the Blitz. Like I was saying, Germany is not going to be spared from city and civilian bombings. Cologne and Dresden are the two cities that are absolutely like hit the hardest, and really Dresden is almost annihilated by the Royal Air Force in late 1944. You're going to have 500,000 civilians die in the city of Dresden, Germany. It was a pretty like horrific bombing attack uh, on the German people there. And again, I mean, like, it's war, and the Brits felt justified in what they were doing because Germany had been bombing London and other cities since 39. But unfortunately, again, you're still bombing civilian populations, and so women, children, elderly are all a part of those collateral damages. And then in Japan, Japan is pretty much safe from city bombings until obviously the end of the war. The big city bombing that takes place um, is the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, which is going to take place at the beginning of 1942. It's our first big like revenge attack for Pearl Harbor on Japan. But as I've told you before, with the Doolittle raid, they had to ditch the planes because the planes that we knew, like, those planes aren't coming back because we couldn't make it back to the aircraft carrier because it was just too far of a distance. And that's part of the reason why Japan is kind of spared from city bombings during the course of the war, is because we can't get our air, we're trying to get closer and closer to Japan, and our bombers just can't make it there and back to the aircraft carrier until the end of 1944. And then in the end of 1944 and through the beginnings of 45, we have aircraft carriers close enough to the island of Japan where we do send bombers in and bomb and come back. And then, of course, very famously, the two most famous bombs ever dropped will be on Japanese soil at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we're going to talk more extensively about that in obviously the last lesson. But, overall, other than the Doolittle raid and then some bombings that are going to occur, again, late 44 into early 45, leading up to the atomic bombs, Japan, for the most part, from 42 to 45 is relatively unscathed. And that's it. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to be putting out a schedule so that y'all know what's coming up tomorrow, and Wednesday is going to be the Holocaust. So, just kind of be prepared for that. You are going to have a web quest activity that you're responsible for that will be a daily grade. And then, of course, watching the video lesson. And please, again, especially for that lesson, watch the videos embedded in the slideshows. They're pretty powerful. So, okay, hope y'all have a great Monday. Only one more after today. And I will see you tomorrow. Bye.